The Seymour Museum is the very first museum of its kind. There is no other museum in the entire Pacific Northwest that is dedicated to telling the stories of the Chicano and Latino community and the contributions and sacrifices that these communities have made in shaping the present and the future of Washington State. Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the Seymour Museum of Chicano, Chicana, Latino, Latina Culture. My name is Thea Cruz Uribe. I am the museum director, and I'm very excited to show you around the museum. The very first thing that I show people when they visit the museum is this poster here. This poster highlights the main concept of the museum. An ongoing journey, the Chicano and Latino community plays an important part in the shaping of Washington State. Their successes and struggles are generations old. Now, the illustration in this poster comes from the artwork on the cover of an album. This album was produced to support farm workers who were on strike. Symbolizes quite perfectly the sacrifices and struggles that many Latinos and Chicanos made in order to have and provide a better future for their family and children. So this section of the museum tells the first story that this museum is dedicated to telling. The Seymour Museum weaves together what I like to call three main stories, and the first story is illustrated by these cabins behind me. Now, these are original and authentic migrant farm working cabins that the Seymour Museum purchased from a farm in eastern Washington. Now, taking a look at these cabins, how old do you think these cabins are? Would it surprise you to learn that these cabins were actually made and lived in as recently as the early 1990s? This section is dedicated to telling the first story. The first story is of the first large influx of Latinos and Chicanos that moved to Washington State during and after World War II. These first Chicano and Latino families were primarily and significantly migrant farm workers, and these were the types of living environments that they came to Washington State to live in. This section of the museum and this first story tells the hardships, the struggles, and the sacrifices that these Chicano and Latino migrant farm working families experienced when they first came here. The second story that the Seymour Museum is dedicated to telling is of the children of the migrant farm working families who first came to Washington State. These children came of age in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement and were inspired to bring that change to Washington State. Their story is illustrated by the photographs on the wall behind me. These children grew up to become significant and prominent leaders in business, in advocacy, in social justice throughout Washington State, and their contributions have paved the way for future Chicanos and Latinos to make more contributions. The third story that the Seymour Museum seeks to tell is the simple fact that all of these struggles, sacrifices, and hardships that Chicanos and Latinos and the Chicano and Latino community has experienced in Washington State in the past, these are still issues today. This simple fact is reflected in every section of this museum. The migration section does not just tell this history of the early Tejano diaspora when families in the 1940s and 50s moved from Texas to Washington State. These migrations still happen today, and the hardships and struggles that go along with them are still happening today. The social activists, the Chicano and Latino students who came of age in the 1960s and were inspired by the Civil Rights Movement, their job is not done and their fight is not over with. This story is reflected throughout every section of the museum, from the education section to the entrepreneurship section to the culture and tradition section. This is the South Gallery of the Seymour Museum. In this part of the museum, we are dedicated to telling not just the broader themes, but more specific individual stories and highlighting specific individuals and individual objects. One theme we have is the El Movimiento section, the Chicano movement, and more specifically how the Chicano movement was brought to Washington State and the impact that the Chicano movement continues to have on the Chicano and Latino community in Washington State. We also have a section on labor, highlighting the contributions, the struggles, the sacrifices, the hardships that agricultural workers are still experiencing today in contributing towards Washington State's very large agricultural industry. We also have a section on community life, because the families who moved to Washington State as far back as the 1930s and 40s, and as recently as today and this year, they're bringing with them not just objects, not just family members, but their traditions and culture as well. We have a section dedicated to talking about different cultural contributions, music, different musical instruments. We have a section talking about sport, boxing, and cockfighting. We have 2 beautiful costumes that were donated by Bailadores de Bronce that highlight the significant cultural contributions that Chicanos and Latinos have made to Washington State. We have a section on the development of the professional class of the Chicano and Latino community, highlighting what the students, these were children of migrant farm workers who grew up in migrant farm working cabins, who grew up in farm camps in eastern Washington, but through legislation and more equitable education and access to educational resources were able to attend college and develop a professional community. This community includes leaders in the business world, dentists, doctors, lawyers, professors, teachers. The South Gallery also includes a section dedicated to telling the stories of the Hispanic, Latino, and Chicano veterans, military service members who often go unrecognized and unrepresented in the history books. The Chicano movement owes a significant debt to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the African American leaders of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers, and the NAACP. They had a significant impact in Washington State, specifically at the University of Washington as well. Cesar Chavez was inspired by Martin Luther King's nonviolence. University of Washington Chicano students were inspired by Black student union members boycotting and protesting on campus. The debt that Chicano movement and the debt that Chicano and Latino activists continue to have towards the civil rights movement and the African American civil rights leaders continues today. The migration stories of Chicano and Latino families who came to Washington State provide an important context. The context not just of the experience of the journey itself, but also the reasons why these families would choose to uproot themselves and move to a completely different state. They would be leaving behind a home that they may have lived in for generations in a border state like Texas. They would be leaving behind friends, family, and possibly even businesses to move to a place that was alien in culture and climate, among many other things. Some reasons for why these families would make such an important decision and leave their home include very poor working conditions. Border states like Texas had a surplus of labor and paid very, very low wages, while states like Washington were offering much higher, often 50% higher wages for farm workers. But another reason is these families would be escaping the intense racism experienced in the border states. Washington State offered up a more welcoming culture. Invitations were extended by farm owners to Chicano and Latino families specifically with Spanish language ads. Of course, the reality, once these families arrived in Washington State, didn't always live up to the hope. Some of these families would arrive at a farm that did not have housing available for them, and there were limited resources available for families that are in positions like this. Racism, while perhaps not as explicit as is in the border states, still did exist in Washington State, and many families did not experience the paradise that they had hoped to find once they came to Washington. As Coretta Scott King said, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won, you win it in every generation. This holds very true for the Seymour Museum. The Seymour Museum is dedicated not just to telling the stories of the past struggles, the past sacrifices, the past contributions of the Chicano and Latino community in Washington State. The Seymour Museum is also dedicated to telling the ongoing journey, the ongoing struggles, the ongoing contributions that the Chicano and Latino community is making and will continue to make in Washington State. The Seymour Museum is very excited to share these stories with you, and we look forward to your visit.